Hello and welcome back for lesson 9. Let's look at the thinking question from lesson 8. If you had to explain what equivalent fractions are to an alien who has never heard of them before, what would you say? So that's a little bit of a different question. And you have to think about how would you explain this idea of equivalent fractions to someone who has never had any experience with equivalent fractions before? Well, I would probably say that it's basically when you take a part of something and you break it up into more or less parts. You still have the same amount of stuff, but you're breaking it up into smaller or larger pieces. But you still have that same amount of stuff, so it just is in different sizes. So I would probably show that by maybe a chocolate bar. I would show them a chocolate bar that has all these little pieces, and I would break the chocolate bar in half, and I would say, look, this chocolate bar is now in 2 pieces. Well, I would take one of those pieces and I would break that in half. So now it's in 4 pieces. And then I would show the alien that those 2 pieces were the same as a half. And so that would be an equivalent fraction. 2/4 would be equivalent to 1/2. Today we're going to be looking at converting fractions, decimals, and percents. And it's going to really help you to understand how you find equivalent fractions, just so that you can understand exactly what we're talking about here. And with this, we also are going to be drawing back on our experience with decimals and then applying that to percentages. So your materials for today are paper, pencil, and calculator, which again is not necessary, but it's highly recommended. And like I said in the introductory video, you can easily access that on your computer most likely. So we should go over some vocabulary first. A percent is anything out of 100. So it's out of 100. A percent means out of 100. So if I say 50%, that means 50 out of 100. If I say 60%, that means 60 out of 100. So it's just a different way of writing and saying fractions as well as decimals, because decimals are also out of 100. So we are going to go through and put some different values in the fraction, percent, and decimal columns, and hopefully you'll be able to pick up on some patterns that we'll then go over together. First, I would like you to pause your video and on your piece of paper, draw 3 columns just like this and label one of them fraction, one of them percent, and one of them decimal. Pause your video and do that now. So now taking a pause from that, we are going to look at this hundreds grid. I have shaded in 3 of the columns, so that's 30 of the blocks out of 100. How would I write this as a fraction? It would be 30 over 100. Or 30 out of 100, because 30 of the squares are shaded in out of the 100 squares. Now I can reduce that fraction and make it 3/10. That's an equivalent fraction right there. 3/10 is equivalent to 30/100. And I figured that out because I divided 30 by 10 and I divided 100 by 10. And I got 3/10. So that would be an equivalent fraction, 3/10. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to write both of those in here. So I have 3 over 10 or 30 over 100. So 3/10 or 30/100. Now, how am I going to write this as a percent and a decimal? As a percent, I'm going to say 30%. This symbol right here means percent. It means out of 100. And then my decimal is going to be 0.3. I could tack on an extra 0 there, but it's not necessary. I could put that 0 there. Like I said, not necessary. So those are going to be my fraction, percent, and decimal. Those are all equivalent. They all say the exact same thing, but they're just different ways to represent the quantity. Now you're going to try one slightly on your own. You're going to find the fraction and decimal for a hundreds grid that I'm going to show you in just a moment. You're not going to find the percent though. So here is the fraction and decimal that you need to find. Pause your video and do that now. So your fraction is going to be 55 over 100, or you could reduce it to 11 over 20. and then your decimal is going to be 0.55 or 55 hundredths because we have 55 of the blocks covered out of the 100. And our percent is going to be 55% because 55 out of the 100 blocks are covered. And like we said, percent always means out of 100. So if we have 55 out of 100 covered, we pretty easily know that it's going to be 55%, 55 out of 100. So fill your chart in with 55 hundredths, 55%, and the decimal for 55 hundredths. Pause the video and do that now. You're going to try one of these completely on your own now, so you're going to come up with the fraction, decimal, and percent for this quantity. So pause your video and do that now. You should have gotten 80 hundredths or 8 tenths for your fraction, and then 80% and 0.8, or you could also read it as 0 and 8 tenths, or 0 and 8 hundredths. There are a bunch of different ways we can read that. So that was great. So that was pretty simple because you just counted the blocks and you knew that there were 80 of them covered out of 100. So that was pretty simple for your fraction, 80 out of 100. And then for your percent, again, pretty simple, it was already out of 100, so it was 80%. And for your decimal, you knew that you had, again, 80 or 8 tenths of the hundreds grid covered, so you knew which place value to put that. Here's another one. You're going to do this one also on your own. Beware of placeholders, but you're going to find the fraction, decimal, and percent. Pause your video and do that now. Your fraction is going to be 7 over 100, or 7 hundredths. And then we only have 7 blocks covered, so it's 7 out of 100, 7%. And our decimal is 0 and 7 hundredths. This is probably the trickiest one for you, because you have to remember that placeholder 0 because we don't have any tenths. Okay, so here's a chart where some of them are filled out and some are not. And you have to be able to figure out what the fraction and the percent is when I give you the decimal, which one the percent and the decimal are when I give you the fraction, and which one the fraction and the decimal are when I give you the percent. So what you're going to do is continuing to use the same chart you've been using, fill out what I already have on here, and then you're going to complete the chart. Pause your video and do that now. All right, so we have a bunch of numbers up here, and each row is related to the other numbers in that row. So you're going to pause your video and you're going to write down as many things as you can that you notice about these numbers and these quantities and how they're related to each other. So pause your video and write that down. There are a lot of different things that you may have noticed, but I'm going to point out just a few that I really want to make sure that you see. So anytime that you have a fraction that is over 100, so your denominator is 100, the number that's your numerator is automatically the number that you can use as your percent, because a percent is out of 100. So if your fraction is also out of 100, it automatically goes without saying that your numerator is going to be the percentage. So as you can see, 7 over 100, 7%. 80 over 100, 80%. 55 over 100, 55%. 30 over 100, 30%. And then whenever a fraction is out of 10, all you have to do is multiply both the numerator and the denominator by 10, and that will get you to an equivalent fraction that's out of 100. So if I had multiplied 8 by 10, I'd get 80, and 10 times 10 is 100, so that got me the 80%. I could have done the same thing up here. 3 times 10 is 30, 10 times 10 is 100, and that's 30 over 100, so I know my percent is 30. The second thing I'd like you to notice is that you can also easily go from a decimal to a percent, or a percent to a decimal. So if you move the decimal point, when you have a percentage, when you move the decimal point twice to the right, because that's the same as multiplying times 100. If I did 0.8 times 100, that would be the same as moving the decimal place 2 times over, because you have to add 2 zeros. So that would give me the number 80. That's my percentage, 80%. If I move this 2 times to the right, that would be 55%. If I move this decimal twice to the right, that would give me 30%. Now it's a little bit trickier when you have, you don't have anything in the tens place. It can make it a little bit harder to see exactly how that works. But again, you still just bring it twice over, My number is 7 now because it doesn't, when I have a whole number, it doesn't matter if I have any zeros before it. And that gives me 7%. Now you can also go the opposite way. If you take the percent, technically I have a decimal point right here because it's a whole number, and I move it twice to the left because that's like dividing by 100, and that would give me a decimal. I'm going to get 0.3. And I don't have to include that in the 0. I can, but I don't have to. If I do the same thing here, move it twice to the left, I get 0.55. Same decimal that I had. Right here, if I move it twice to the left, it's going to be 0.8. Same thing I got over here. Here, again, it's a little bit trickier just to keep track of things. I move it once to the left, but I have to move it twice, otherwise it's not going to be out of 100 for the decimal. So here's my decimal here, and now I need a placeholder 0, and that gets me 7/100ths. It can be pretty easy to see the relationship between fractions and percents, but it can be a little bit trickier when we add decimals into the mix. But if you remember when we talked about decimals, decimals are always out of 100 or out of 10 or out of some derivative of that. So basically, we're saying that this is, because this is the hundredths place, we're saying 7 out of 100. Here, this is in the tenths place, so I can say 8 out of 10, or I can, because the 0 is in the hundredths place, I can say 80 out of 100. And it's saying the same thing as the fraction, which is saying the same thing as the percent. So they're all interconnected and very easily transferable. Now you're going to work on this chart. I have given you some information. I've either given you the decimal, the fraction, or the percent. And using what you know now about fractions, decimals, and percents, you're going to figure out what the equivalent percentage is and the equivalent decimal is, or the fraction and decimal, or the fraction and percent for each row. So you're going to continue using the chart that you were using on your paper and fill it out with these 4 new quantities. Pause your video and do that now. So here are the answers. In the top row, I had given you 0 and 18/100ths. Well, the way I read that should give you a hint as to what your fraction would be. 18/100ths, 18 out of 100. So that's going to be your fraction. And your percent, because it's over 100, I can automatically switch that to a percent and say 18%. The second row, we have 6/10. That's a little bit trickier. So maybe I'm going to hop over to my decimal first, because I know how to write 6/10. I would put my 6 in the tenths place, and then I can find my percent 2 ways. I can either move my decimal twice to the right, and I'm going to have 60%, or I can multiply 6 times 10 and 10 times 10 to get 60 over 100. That would also get me my answer of 60%. Now the next one we have to be careful with placeholders. We have 4%, so that means 4 out of 100. Well, that's pretty simple to then write our fraction, 4 over 100. Now, if I take the way I read this, 4/100ths, I can easily transfer that to a decimal. I know that 4/100ths is going to go in this place value because it's the hundredths place value, and I do need my placeholder 0 in the tenths because I don't have any. And finally, the last one, 97%. I know that says 97 out of 100, so I wrote my fraction, 97 over 100, and then I transferred that to my decimal, which was 97/100ths. So I'm going to put a 9 in the tenths place and a 7 in the hundredths place. So let's try a word problem. During a 10-mile workout on the treadmill, the screen tells you that you are 30% done with your workout. What fraction of the mileage have you completed? So, let's just give a visual here. Let's say this is the starting point. So this is 0 miles, and your goal is to get to 10 miles. And the machine is telling you that you're 30% done. So how many miles, or what fraction of the miles have you completed? If you figure out how many miles you've completed, you'll be able to figure out the fraction pretty easily. Pause the video and try that now. Okay, so you know that you have completed 30%. So 30% is the same as 30 over 100. So you have completed, if you were to break the run up into 100 little pieces, you have completed 30 of those little pieces. Now, in order to find what fraction I've completed, well, 30 over 100 works, or I can find the equivalent fraction of 3/10. So that also tells me how many miles I've finished, because this says 3 out of 10. Well, I'm doing 10 miles, so that means I've done 3 out of 10 miles at 30% of the way through the run. Here's another one. At the store, you notice that there's a sale for 45% off all jeans. What fraction of the cost will you have to pay? So we don't know how much they cost. I'm not asking you how much you're going to be paying. I'm just asking what fraction of the cost will you have to pay? Pause the video and solve that now. It's pretty simple. You just took your percent and you had to convert it to a fraction. So you knew that 45% means 45 out of 100. So that's your initial fraction. And then I actually reduced it by dividing by 5. And that got me 9/20. So that's an equivalent fraction that says the same thing. Last one. Cassie and John have completed 82 out of 200 levels of their favorite video game. What fraction, percentage, and decimal represents how much they have completed? So we need to find the fraction, decimal, and percent of how much they have completed on their video game. Pause your video and try to do that now. You have to be really careful on this one, because if you wrote out your fraction initially as 82 over 200, because that's how many levels there are all together, so 82 are completed out of the 200, then you realize that the denominator was not 100. In order to make an easy conversion from fraction to percent to decimal, it has to be out of 100. You can't just say 82% when it's out of 200, because that's saying 82 out of 200, not 82 out of 100. So I reduced my fraction by dividing it by 2, because I knew 200 divided by 2 equals 100, and 82 goes into 2 evenly, and I got 41 over 100. Now I can easily convert to a percent, 41% because that's 41 out of 100, and my decimal is 0 and 41 hundredths. Great work today with these fractions, decimals, and percents. There's going to be another lesson that's closely related to this one that's going to be called Lesson 9, Extra Percentages, and on that lesson you're going to be learning how to actually create percentages when they are out of a different whole than 100. So the thinking question will not be answered in that lesson, but it will be answered in Lesson 10, so just hold tight to this one. And I would really encourage you to watch the extra Lesson 9. So why do you think we use percentages if we can say the exact same thing with fractions and decimals? So what's the purpose of percentages? That's what this is asking. All right, so think about that and watch the extra lesson for Lesson 9 and then move on to Lesson 10. Goodbye.